Hello and welcome to another chat for Military History Non-Visualized. I'm Justin, and joining me here is TacError. TacError is an independent researcher who focuses on the Soviet Army. I've invited him here today to discuss the collapse of the Soviet Army from 1989 to 1993. Welcome, TacError.
Hello there.
And we'll just jump into the questions. So I guess to start off, one can often find claims that the state of the post-Soviet armies of the early and mid-1990s was indicative of the quality of the force that came before it. Is there any truth to this? What was the state of the Soviet army before the collapse began?
Yeah, it's a good question. And to answer this, from my own personal experience, you usually find these arguments mainly in wargaming forums and stuff like War Thunder, World of Tanks kind of forums. It's because that during the collapse of the Soviet military and the collapse of the USSR and the participation of the Russian military that grew out of the grew out of the core of the Soviet military after 1991 in Chechnya. There was a lot of external observers looking at the Russian army during this war, and of course the Russian army performed pretty terribly, as you know from all the sources we read. For me, this is a post hoc argument that pundits usually use to criticize the military effectiveness of the Soviet military and to vindicate a NATO-slash version of professional NCOs, mission-type tactics, and low-level initiative. You will also find this argument pretty much backported into war games about the Third World War in the 1980s, like war game Red Dragon, and other types of tabletop war games, for example, like Team Yankee. They often use the proof of the Russian military's performance in Chechnya as proof why the Soviet military would perform terribly against NATO in a 1980s kind of scenario. Additionally, the problem is that they avoid discussing the context and reasons why the Russian Federation military put on such a bad performance in the 1990s. There's a really good book by William Odom called The Collapse of the Soviet Military. In the conclusion, he argues against the point that because the Soviet military collapsed in the 1990s, that it's not logical to say that the Soviet military would perform terribly against NATO in Central Europe because it require hard evidence that would come from a war that pretty much never happened. And the state of the army before the collapse period was pretty much a force that was oriented, optimized for mechanized theater war against NATO and the People's Republic of China. And while the army was terribly suited for the war in Afghanistan, there were tactical developments that were brought by the conventional army that were discussed in conventional military journals, such as the Browning Group battle tactic, which was an evolution on one of their mechanized infantry battle drills. And the Soviet military was also a force that was pretty much facing a lot of incoming bloc obsolescence because fundamentally, the Soviet army was the epitome of the industrial economy army that started in World War One and saw its prime time in World War Two. So mass conscripts, masses of armored vehicles and trucks, mechanized artillery, and military operations based around directing and organizing large-scale forces. During this time, in the 1970s and 1980s, there were thinkers in the Soviet military who kind of saw that the industrial military was not pretty much the prime time in the near future. And you're going to see that the future battlefield was going to be revolutionized by smaller agile forces, and it will be dominated by precision-guided weapons and sensor systems dominated by computer chips. And this was a sort of battlefield that the Soviets couldn't hope to adapt because they were hopelessly behind the West in development of microelectronics and microchips. So in short, I would say the Soviet military was a force that could engage with its potential foes in large-scale combat operations in a conventional World War recon scenario, right? But it was approaching a dead end because they themselves saw that future war was no longer going to be about who could best organize and direct their tank divisions. It's going to be about being the guy with the most precision guided weapons and computer systems which could direct those weapons.
So, what were the mechanics of the dissolution? Was it a combination of top down directives and bottom up disintegration? So, how controlled was this dissolution of the Soviet army?
Yeah, so that's a good question because reading about this, the actual mechanics were really complex and messy because it wasn't like a straightforward cessation transfer to the countries that formed when the Soviet Union collapsed. You could compare this to, say, disbandment of the East German military into the Bundeswehr in the 1990s. We're pretty much talking about a large military that's being chopped into 15 different pieces. And some of those pieces have to create several pieces of infrastructure and command structures out of scratch. So I can only provide like a really incomplete answer to this because it was so complex. So in my view, it wasn't so much of a bottom-up kind of disintegration that you saw in, say, the Imperial Army in 1917. It was more of a kind of a top-down kind of thing. And it was a complex process where Soviet military units were being divided after state-to-state negotiations, and in some cases of unilateral declarations of loyalty. Like, for example, during the August coup in 1991 in Moscow, there was a rule where Soviet officers like Alexander Lebed were kind of not really supportive of the hardliner communists, and they kind of dragged their feet when the communists gave them orders to enter and blockade the Russian White House, for example. And another figure would be like Boris Shaposhnikov, who was the commander of the Soviet Air Force in August 1991. He also kind of like dragged his feet when given orders by coup leaders as well. And after the August coup, the military was kind of like in this limbo state because political authority had all collapsed, right? There was both a sense that there was business as usual, and there were also major changes that were happening. So in the center, there was a major coup of pro-coup officers, where 8 deputy defense ministers, 9 director chiefs, and 7 military district commanders were removed from their posts. And on top leadership, people who supported Boris Yeltsin, who was the president of the Russian Federative Socialist Republic, became defense minister because they had supported Yeltsin and opposed the coup plotters. During this time, there was also both a transformation of Soviet military into this sort of like unrealized command structure, Commonwealth of Independent States Armed Forces, and parallel to this was formation of Republican Armed Forces in 1991. So, for example, in Ukraine, in 24th of August, there was the Supreme Soviet adopted a decree where they would begin forming military formations in Ukraine, followed by a later one in December 1991 on actual formation of Ukraine armed forces. And in other states like Moldova, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Armenia, all these states in their legislative systems pretty much adopted decrees where they would formally establish their own armed forces in the near future. And in 1992, pretty much all of these post-Soviet states formed their own defense ministries and armed forces. But it's also important to realize that once these independent armed forces were created, they were pretty much like Soviet military units that changed their name tapes, and they still ran according to like Soviet mentality and organization. For example, in Ukraine, they pretty much had 3 military districts that pretty much switched allegiance to Ukraine. But one of the problems they had was that because they had no infrastructure to create their own Ministry of Defense, they had to like create a lot of institutions from scratch. But at the end of the day, the bulk of the former Soviet military couldn't remain politically accountable to nobody. And in the case of the Commonwealth of Independent States Armed Forces, the Ukrainian involvement, because during this time, under Konstantin Morozov, he and President Leonid Kravchuk wanted to create an actual independent Ukrainian military, and without Ukrainian involvement, the Commonwealth Army was meaningless.
This concludes the first podcast on the collapse of the Soviet Army. The second part will get into more details about how the units of the Soviet Army were distributed, how the Soviet Army reacted to the dissolution of the state, the impact on the esprit de corps, and various other questions. Big thank you here to TacError and Justin for making this video possible. Thank you for watching and see you next time.